Mirasee.
So if people believe that the future is dangerous and apocalyptic, they are taking actions often that lead to more of that. So I think helping people get really clear about realizing that that socialization isn't necessarily true, and it certainly doesn't have to be true, and that we could create a different vision of the future, and from that, create a different reality.
Hi, I'm Dr. Irena O'Brien, and you're listening to Neuroscience of Coaching. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist with almost 30 years of study and practice in psychology and neuroscience. And as the founder of the Neuroscience School, I teach coaches and other wellness professionals real-world, evidence-based strategies to use in their own practices. In each episode, I invite a seasoned coach to discuss a topic that affects our field. And together, we provide you with science-based tools to help your clients reach their goals by working with their brains to create results that last. Today, we're going to look at a huge topic that's becoming more and more chronic: despair about the future. Reports about bleak futures are all around us. And even if you personally insulate yourself from negative news and social media, you're affected by people around you who take too much of this in. And if you're listening to this as a coach, your clients may be feeling chronic or acute despair about the state of the world and their future. There's an old saying that negative news travels 10 times faster than positive news. Also, a long-time adage in journalism says, if it bleeds, it leads. For these reasons, the crises we face will continue to get disproportionate representation in news and social media. It's a double-edged sword because these crises do need extra attention, but we also can't let the drone of negativity lead to hopelessness. Unfortunately, the situation is compounded by the human brain's hardwired focus on negative news. Evolutionary psychology suggests that our early ancestors survived because they put greater importance on negative information than positive information. And this makes sense. Knowledge of predatory animals or threatening humans was far more critical to know than where a nearby delicious food source was. But of course, we're not living in prehistoric times. And ironically, Canadian psychologist and thought leader Dr. Steven Pinker has demonstrated through objective research that we are actually living in the safest and most abundant time in human history. This isn't true for everyone, obviously. Millions of people are suffering as I say this. But for the totality of the planet, we have less violence, disease, war, pain, and hardship than ever before. And yet, in survey after survey, people express a feeling of despair and hopelessness about how bad things are and how bad the future will be. This occurs in part because our predictive brains are highly susceptible to bias and influence. Instead of responding rationally to new information, we tend to subconsciously use it to reinforce our existing beliefs and self-identity. Likewise, in challenging times, a whole host of hormones flood our brains and disrupt our executive thinking. It can easily become a downward spiral. Because coaching draws from many sciences, we must educate ourselves on how the brain perceives what we learn and believe to be true, both for ourselves and our clients. And neuroscience is a big key to this understanding. So for today's episode, we're going to explore our society's current state of despair, how it affects our clients and us, and how we can create and foster a more optimistic and hopeful future perspective. Like I said, it's a huge issue, so I'm honored to have with me today someone who shares my passion for this topic, the highly regarded coach and best-selling author, Dr. Eve Agee. Dr. Eve Agee is the founder of the Transform Coaching Academy, rated as one of the top coaching certification programs in the world, and accredited by the International Coach Federation. She also happens to be an anthropologist with extensive expertise in shamanism, breathwork, and holistic healing. Her work has been featured on NBC, ABC, BBC, Apple News, Google News, and NPR. She's also won numerous awards and grants for her women's empowerment research in the U.S. and West Africa. It's her mission to help certified coaches thrive financially while empowering others. Thank you so much, E, for being on my show today.
Irena, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So, before we get into the depths of this topic, could you share a bit more about your journey and how that led to your coaching work?
I was always interested in cultures and history and society. And in college, initially, I started studying political science. And when I was 20, I decided to move to West Africa. And I went to school in Togo, West Africa for university. And it just totally opened my eyes. This was a long time ago, actually 37 years ago. And so at that time, it was before most people had computers, way before cell phones, all that sort of stuff. So I was completely immersed in the culture. And I was just amazed at the ways that, in particular in southern Togo where I lived, women were really empowered. And I was really amazed by their culture and the different healing techniques and just the differences from where I grew up in the US. And so I went back to the US and was finishing my undergraduate studies and ended up studying international relations, which included anthropology. So I kind of fell in love with anthropology. I ended up going back to Togo and doing research with women's empowerment and teaching English after I finished my undergraduate. I applied for grad school in anthropology. And I went and did my master's and PhD in anthropology at the University of Virginia, and actually also did some more research in West Africa and Burkina Faso, as well as in the US. And during that time, I really learned about the different ways that people think about the world, or different beliefs people and different cultures have about the world, and how it really shifts our experiences. And I also ended up apprenticing in shamanism for several years while I was doing my PhD. And by the time I finished my PhD, I had done a lot of different research about the ways people viewed health, their own health, health systems, mental health, women's health. And I realized when I finished my PhD, rather than wanting to be a professor, I was really being called to take all that information that I'd learned in these different traditions and bring it in a new way. Now, this was in the late 1990s, and I had not yet heard about coaching. I ended up actually working for the Clinton White House doing education and health policy. And while I was doing that, I got introduced to what was still a pretty new field of coaching. And so I became a coach. So this was 25 years ago almost. And so once I finished at the White House, I opened up my own practice as a coach. And I also incorporated practices from shamanism and other traditions I had learned. And what I discovered with coaching is it actually draws a lot, I believe, from cultural anthropology theory about how we view the world and how our beliefs really shape our experience. And so I started working with my clients. People had huge breakthroughs. And I've been doing it ever since. And for the last 15 years, I've run Transform Coaching Academy. Now it's credited ICF, now a level 1 accreditation program with ICF. And so I've trained hundreds of people around the world to be certified coaches. And I really believe that coaches are here to help raise the consciousness on the planet. And we have a huge focus on the future in coaching. So this is something that's extremely important for us as coaches and really dear to my heart.
What a fascinating story. And you and I have the same mission. Mine also is to raise consciousness on the planet. I do it differently than you, but that's still my mission. So what immediately came to mind as you listened to what I said in the opening about the paradox of Steven Pinker's research and the negativity that so many people feel?
The first part that really came to me as you talked about that is that instead of mobilizing, that humans throughout human history, we have mobilized to make huge changes. Like when you think about that JFK announced, in the US, we're going to put a man on the moon. Everything mobilized to do that. When the US entered World War II, there was this huge mobilization, right? People changed so much. A lot of young men went off to fight the war. Women entered the workforce in a way they hadn't before. People rationed food, like they made sacrifices. They did everything they could because they wanted a certain outcome. So we know we have the possibility to do that in human history and for humanity. Yet, for the most part, we have not found the broad leadership with the most powerful countries that has said, yes, we need to do that. And I think that's where the real tragedy is, because had we listened to this and actually made the structural changes, let's say 30, 45, even 20 or 15 or 10 years ago, I think we'd be in a very different situation. We actually could be creating a future that is much, much brighter. And so humans went from really kind of not taking it seriously to saying, oh, it's hopeless. There's nothing we can do about it. We didn't get that middle part where we're like, yes, we have to mobilize to make these changes. I'm still hopeful that that can happen. Although we know now that because we've waited so long, that, some of the environmental changes and catastrophes, we probably can't do as well if we would have mobilized earlier.
Yeah. So, as I said in my opening, our brains are hardwired to protect us through predictive thinking, which draws us to negative news, motivates us to reinforce our existing beliefs and reject contrary information. So, what experience do you have in helping people work through this to embrace new thinking and especially to avoid despair?
I believe, just like you said, your mission is to raise the consciousness on the planet. I believe that's one of the major gifts that as coaches we bring to the world, right? That we have these tools to help people move out of limiting negative thinking into inspired action. And the more we can actually do our work as coaches and raise that consciousness, the more likely we will be to help humanity to actually make the steps that we need to take. Because part of that, I believe, is actually, and it's some of the work I both teach in Transform Coaching Academy and I do in my one-on-one coaching, is to really help people connect with the future they want. And when we look at some of the biggest social changes in human history in the last few hundred years, a lot of them have come through big social justice movements or technological innovations. So if we look at big social justice movements, such as the end of African and African American slavery, the African civil rights movement, the end of apartheid, the end of colonization in many, many countries, the way people found the strength to take action against those people who, were in power and wanted to keep these corrupt and oppressive systems was, my understanding, because I've spent a lot of time studying this, both during my PhD and since then, was to actually really focus on the future that they want. And I think that is a tool that we can use as coaches, because helping people really get clear about the future they want is something we do as coaches. And those are tools we can actually bring to the world to help ordinary people, but also help leaders and others to get really clear. Because if we get clear about the future we want, I believe that even though right now we have done a huge amount of devastation to the environment, I believe we could actually create a future that will both heal the environment, but also bring more social justice and be healthy for humans as well.
Yeah, the neuroscience shows that thinking about our future selves activates the same brain areas as thinking about a stranger. And so that's what can make it difficult, right? To create or to vision a compelling future for yourself. What it activates the same brain areas as when you're thinking about a stranger.
Well, I think if we as coaches actually can walk people through getting clear, what do they want for their future, right? And we can do that both collectively, but we can also do it one-on-one. And this is something I do a lot, helping people. What do you want? What would be your ideal future here? What would feel good for you? What would inspire you? And when I've done that with people, they're able to really connect with it very strongly. They're able to transform their relationship with the future. So they're feeling excited and inspired. They're able to take the actions they want rather than feeling hopeless and overwhelmed.
Yeah. We read or hear in the news a lot about burnout, especially around work, and especially in the United States. And how much do you think this is actually tied to underlying hopelessness about the future?
I think it's probably very related, right? Because we know when people feel hopeless about the future, when they're feeling that the future is going to be devastating, it's scary, they don't know how it's going to turn out, that is creating a tremendous amount of stress every day, right? And it's those constant stress hormones that really contribute to burnout and exhaustion. So I think it's a huge contribution to that. We also know that even in people who are in very difficult situations, but they have a positive view about the future, they're often able to get through those difficult situations much more easily because that inspiration about the future becomes a motivator rather than something that burns them out.
Right. It reminds me of Viktor Frankl, right? It all depends on people who have a mission. So, Viktor Frankl was in a Nazi camp during the war. And really, the conditions were horrible and hopeless for most people. And yet the people who survived psychologically were those that had a compelling mission.
Yeah, and I think this is really important because all the news we see about the future and everything happening in the world, not just environmental, right? Just all the different things. We've got multiple wars, we've got famines, we have all sorts of huge, huge issues. I think it feels so overwhelming for a lot of people. They feel that they can't make a difference, that what they do doesn't matter. And so they don't have that mission, right? Or maybe they lose hope or faith in their mission. And so I believe the more that we can create a common vision for the future for humanity that is worth everyone really moving towards, I think that's going to inspire people in huge ways and make a big difference.
Yeah. So, what is your personal experience dealing with overcoming negative thinking about the future?
One of the things I do is talk about how we are programmed for a negative future, to believe the future is negative. And I do believe the cultural programming, certainly in the US, but in many Western cultures, and then also in other cultures I'm going to call empire-based cultures. Often there's been a lot of really negative, apocalyptic socialization about the future. And I believe it's often used because it's a great form of social control, right? If you're trying to oppress people and dominate them, one of the best ways to do that is to paint a really negative view of the future because it makes them hopeless. It makes them lose their motivation that maybe they can change the situation they're in. Now, as an anthropologist, I know there's actually lots of other cultures that aren't empire-based. They're not as oppressive and dominated-based. A lot of these cultures are more indigenous that actually didn't have negative views about the future, right? And a lot of Native American cultures, a lot of cultures in Africa and other parts of the world throughout the Americas. And a lot of those indigenous cultures think about themselves as caretakers for the future, that their main mission is to actually leave their community and the planet in better condition for future generations. So that's a very different relationship with the future. So one of the things I do in my coaching is help people understand or become aware of how are they programmed for the future, right? And the interesting thing is, if you look at Western culture, this is, the whole idea of the apocalypse is a couple of thousand years old, right? And we've seen it. If you look at US history, like the idea of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the US, I was raised believing, we were going to create this nuclear war and we're going to blow up the world. And it was actually when I was living in West Africa in my early 20s, and I mentioned that to a friend, and he said, "What are you talking about? That was never going to happen." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, we knew that both the US and the Soviet Union and Europeans in general are way too egotistical and narcissistic. They would never kill each other. They would never really blow up their own culture." And so I started talking to people there about their views of the future, because that was sort of my first piece of realizing, I've been socialized to believe in this really apocalyptic future. But one of the things that happens is when we have that mindset or attitude, then often people take actions from it, right? So if people believe that the future is dangerous and apocalyptic, they are taking actions often that lead to more of that. So I think helping people get really clear about realizing that socialization isn't necessarily true, and it certainly doesn't have to be true, and that we could create a different vision of the future, and from that, create a different reality.
Wow, this is eye-opening. I don't even know what to say to that, but it is truly eye-opening. So that points really to the importance of consuming a wide variety of content so that you do get the different views and the different ideas.
Exactly. YouTube's a great place. And if we actually started listening more to like indigenous leaders and indigenous people who are really actually addressing the climate crisis, a lot of the indigenous island nations, a lot of indigenous people in the Americas, they are people who really respect the earth. And I think this is the key part here, right? Is these, what I'm calling empire cultures or societies. US is certainly one, but there's also other ones like Russia and China and other places that think of the earth as something where they're just going to extract everything they can out of it. They don't respect it at all. They just want to use it to get whatever they want, right? If we take and really listen and follow leaders who are from other kinds of cultures who have a very different relationship with the earth, with animals, with humans, where they actually feel that we are all a connected web of life and that we can honor the earth and really live in a different way, then we can start to expand our consciousness in a way that I think opens us up to understanding both the present and the future in a much more, let's say, perhaps enlightened way or uplifting way.
Wow, I'm just learning so much from you, Eve. So, do you have a particular story of a client or someone who comes to mind, like related to our conversation today?
Oh, when we're talking about people shifting their view of the future? Oh, that's a great question. If I'm going to think of someone in particular, she came to me and she had really, really struggled in life. She was a single mom and she had struggled a lot financially. She had struggled wanting to do work that was more meaningful for her, but she also struggled in a lot of different other ways, some health issues. And in working with her around this and helping her see how a lot of her attitudes were and her beliefs, including she had a lot of negative beliefs about herself and her potential and really her value and her worth, right? And so helping her understand that those are just attitudes, right? That they're not the truth of who she is. And that she could choose to consider herself and relate to herself and relate to the world and her future in a very different way. She was able to shift a lot in her life, really start creating a lot more income. She started actually doing work as a coach and built a really successful coaching business. Also, at this point, I think her kids were probably in junior high or high school around that time. And she'd been really struggling, but really created better relationships with them and was able to empower them in ways that she had not been empowered by her own family. This is something I've worked with countless people on, and it's amazing the transformations that happen as people get clarity and more consciousness around this.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that story, Eve. Yeah, when you live in a state of hopelessness, it just drains your energy.
And not just that. When we live in a state of hopelessness, it can make us sick, right? There's all sorts of research that shows a lot of diseases may be caused in a large extent to stress and what happens to the nervous system as we are constantly living in that kind of hopelessness and despair. It's incredibly challenging.
Yeah, something that you said was about your client that she didn't have meaning. And so I want to go back to Viktor Frankl because he didn't talk about mission, right? He found that people in the concentration camp who had meaning, they were the ones who survived psychologically better than those who didn't, just gave up.
Yeah, and I think that is so pertinent right now with the future because I feel like many of the people I know, both personally and professionally, are feeling incredibly hopeless about the future. And they feel like there's nothing they can do to make it better. And unfortunately, when we feel that way, and I think a lot of the world feels that way right now, billions of people most likely. Unfortunately, when we feel that way, it really takes us out of that meaning. It takes us out of the purpose. And so for me, I believe that my purpose and the meaning I'm bringing is to help people raise their consciousness, is to help create a better world for all. I do believe it can happen. I don't know if it will even happen in my lifetime, right? But I do believe it can happen. And for me, I focus, that's my meaning and that's my purpose. And I think it gives me a lot of inspiration and it gives me a lot of pleasure. And I get to meet other people like yourself and so many others who are also doing this, who are connecting with that. And it is probably one of the most powerful things to help us get through these really challenging times.
Exactly. So there are a couple of things that I wanted to add, because I want to leave our listeners with some more practical tools. As Eve said, meaning is important. It's also important to take some actionable steps. And so utopian thinking can only go so far without pragmatic thinking. So transform your positive vision for the future into action that you can take today and every day, no matter how small. And it's been shown again and again that success most often comes from small, consistent actions rather than big leaps. And from a neuroscience perspective, the small, completed, forward-moving tasks provide us what's sometimes called the dopamine drip. Right? So dopamine is the feel-good chemical in the brain, and getting a healthy dose of this on a regular basis is important for long-term positive thinking and outcomes. And the other thing is don't engage in negative mainstream and social media news reports. People jokingly call it doom scrolling, but it's really not funny. Feeding on the negative news coming across your devices is putting your mental health at risk. It's also causing the algorithms of the internet to serve up more negative news to you. And how could anyone stay hopeful in the face of this? Instead of pretending to be superhuman and thinking you can take bad news in without any negative effect, put a limit on it. Finally, is there anything else you'd like to say to our listeners?
First of all, I love everything you shared. I think it's really important. I know 2 weeks ago, I took a news detox just for a week. I stayed off the news and I honestly felt much better at the end of the week. I think in addition to really not getting into doom scrolling, all that, there are some news sources that are focused on what are good things that are happening in the world, right? And it could be volunteering. It could be doing something where you're connecting with other people. I mean, people who are coaches, we get to do that through our work. We're I think it's a huge honor and a huge blessing to get to do that. But finding some ways where you're connecting with others, whether it's other people who also have a similar mission of helping their community or helping others, or if it's just getting together and laughing with a friend, because I do think that human connection and that finding that laughter and finding that joy and getting that dopamine in a way that really lifts us up is also really important right now.
Yeah, I agree. I remember back at the 2008 financial crisis, I got really hooked on the news and I was reading tons and tons of news about the crisis every day. And after several weeks, I thought, oh, I'm becoming depressed. So I stopped reading the news. And now I just look through the headlines so that I'm on, kind of on top of what's happening in the world. But that's as far as I go with the news now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it's great to keep it where you're mainly reading, even if just reading the headlines, rather than I find watching TV news or even listening to the radio, I feel like for me personally, it is more emotionally draining. Where if I can read it personally, for me, it's not, even if it's just reading the headlines, it's not getting me as emotionally invested, which I find helpful.
Yeah. There's one more thing that I wanted to say before we close off, and that is if you're just consuming all this negative information without doing anything about it, you're just traumatizing yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Over and over again. So you do have to take steps to get out of that, right? By joining a group, by taking some small action. I mean, even if it's just something like knitting scarves and sending them over to Ukraine for the winter, but something that does give you that dopamine and makes you feel like you're doing something.
Yeah. And that is doing something. I mean, that is actually helping people. It's a beautiful purpose, a beautiful, meaningful thing to do.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a perfect way to close out the show today. Thank you so much, Eve. And what's the best way for listeners to learn more about you and what you do?
People can reach me at transformcoachingacademy.com. That's transformcoachingacademy.com. Or at eveagee.com. That's EVEAGEE.com.
Okay, thank you. I'm so grateful you could join me today. And that was such a great conversation on such an important topic.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to be here.
So thank you, everyone, for listening. For all the benefits the internet and social media have brought us, we also have to face the reality that our open information society is causing us great harm. Evolutionary psychology has shown us that negative news generates a much greater response in our brains than positive news. This is because in our ancient ancestors' era of true life or death survival, the news of a nearby threat was far more important than the promise of a nearby reward. And our modern media know this, use it to generate more attention, and we likewise give it more of our attention. But in doing so, we sacrifice a big part of our mental and emotional well-being, giving up happiness in the present for fear of the future. The good news is that neuroscience and psychology provide us with tools, and here are 4 good ones to use. The first one is maintain baseline thinking of a positive future. Imagine your fears not coming true. John Lennon sang about this perfectly in his biggest hit song, appropriately titled Imagine. Join a positive, supportive community. John Lennon's closing line in that song is, I hope someday you will join us and the world will live as one. The benefits of being together in the face of challenge apply today as much as when he sang that song in 1971. And take actionable steps, whether this is news to you or a good reminder. All positive thinking and goal accomplishment is rooted in small, consistent steps forward. It's not a coincidence that walking fitness apps literally measure our steps to motivate us. And do a self-care check on your news and media intake. How much is it every day? How much is negative versus positive? How do you feel when you spend less time on your phone? Think about how you can replace time looking at your screens with a time spent in more healthy ways, whether it's outdoors in nature, talking face-to-face with friends, creating something, or engaging in whatever brings you joy. Most of us actually have many positive things we can choose to do any given day, and choosing these will naturally foster a more positive mindset for our overall well-being. I'm Dr. Irena O'Brien, and you've been listening to Neuroscience of Coaching. You can find out more about me at neuroscienceschool.com. Neuroscience of Coaching is a part of the Mirasee FM podcast network, which also includes such shows as Just Between Coaches and To Lead is Human. This episode was produced by Andrew Chapman. Danny Inney is our executive producer, and Marvin Del Rosario is our audio editor. To make sure you don't miss great episodes coming up on Neuroscience of Coaching, please follow us on Mirasee FM's YouTube channel or your favorite podcast player. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a comment or a starred review. It's the best way to help us get these ideas out there to more people. Thanks, and we hope you'll join us next time.